Thank you, thank you. I want to talk today about some of the same things, but from a very different perspective. And I'm going to start by talking about the past, because I am a historian. You know, and it was actually the topic I was asked to speak about was nostalgia. You know, nostalgia is a very seductive emotion. And I don't think that very many of us, when we feel about coming on, would pick up the phone and think about calling the doctor. But 200 years ago, nostalgia was considered an extremely dangerous and contagious pathology, a very serious disorder that could lead, if untreated, to depression, delusion, dementia, even death. The word was coined by a 17th century doctor who wanted to describe the intense algos, or pain, that many of the people he and his colleagues were seeing because they were missing their nostos, their native home. It was literally homesickness. And it was considered such a pathology that doctors were really concerned about how to hold it in check. During the Civil War, Union doctors said that they diagnosed 5,000 soldiers with clinical cases of nostalgia, and determined that 74 of them had actually died from the disease. The Army brass were pretty concerned about this, so they prohibited the bands from playing Home Sweet Home, because that might add to the contagion. It wasn't actually until 200 years ago that doctors discovered there is actually a healthy kind of nostalgia. A nostalgia that, instead of leading to depression, makes you optimistic. That, oh, I once had these great interactions with people, I could rebuild them. That instead of just wanting to go back somewhere else, that you go forward as well as renewing and strengthening older ties. And as I thought about it, I realized the main difference between pathological nostalgia and healthy nostalgia is a longing to recapture a feeling, not to return to a particular place and time. Healthy nostalgia then allows you to think about how can you do that. You can reach out to others. It obviously involves a little selective memory. I mean, how many of us would have second children if we didn't forget the pain of childbirth? Or, you know, treasure those family vacations if you didn't forget all the fights in the car getting there, or how drunk, you know, the uncle got at Thanksgiving. But it doesn't descend into the delusion that everyone had all the good feelings all the time. And that's where you get the pathological nostalgia. When this intensely individualized, personalized nostalgia gets extended to an entire era, where you think that everyone felt the same thing at all the time, that's when it becomes pathological. That's when you begin to stop wanting to recreate a feeling, and you long to recreate a time and a place where there were no outsiders to interfere with the way that everybody else supposedly felt. That becomes past sickness. And I would say that that's a pretty serious disease itself. One of the things researchers find is the healthy nostalgia actually makes people feel warmer, literally warmer. And it makes them act warmer toward other people because they want to recapture this feeling, they want to rebuild this feeling. The unhealthy nostalgia, the past sickness, makes people feel hostile to newcomers. It makes them feel depressed rather than optimistic. It makes them, researchers find that when people nostalgize, or I don't think that's a word, when people think nostalgically about their experience as members of a group or of an era, they become less optimistic. They become hostile to strangers and outsiders. And eventually that collapses into the pathology of past sickness, where they want to no longer relate to outsiders. It makes them hostile to strangers. And it also makes them then vulnerable to delusions, to the kind of politicized nostalgia and fake history that so many individuals in our society put forward as a way of pushing a contemporary political agenda. So I want to talk for a few minutes about every group has nostalgia. Probably the most well-known one in America is the conservative version of nostalgia. You all know it. We were founded as a Christian nation by people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, stood on their own 2 feet, and vigorously rejected all taxation and government regulation as interferences on their liberty. This is cherry picking at its worst. Actually, I've spent most of my life combating this kind of myth, so I won't linger on it. But I can't resist in this political climate adding a couple of historical corrections. For example, our founders really did want to build a wall, but the wall they meant was a wall of separation between church and state. And they specifically invited Hindus, Jews, and Muslims into that. Our founders, not everyone was as radical as the Pennsylvania state constitution that completely abolished any inheritance, taxed it all prohibitively, because they said that where wealth is hereditary, power is hereditary, because wealth is power. James Madison didn't go that far, but he said that it was the role of government to reduce extreme wealth to a state of mediocrity and to increase extreme indigence to a state of comfort, something that has been somewhat lacking in our political debates since then. And to accomplish that end, both Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin said we should tax the earnings of the rich in direct geometrical proportion as they rise. So it's a little cherry picking there. Well, but conservatives don't have a monopoly on cherry picking. Remember the campaign when Trump said, "Oh, let's make America great again," and Hillary responded, "Let's make America whole again." And as a historian, I was thinking, well, exactly what decade did she have in mind then? I think she was talking about her husband's administration in the 1990s, a time when there was the don't ask, don't tell policy. Confederate flags still flew above most of the southern capitals and all elsewhere. And of course, this was a time when political civility didn't include not refusing to call young black men super predators and beginning to build the state. Now, having said that, I have to confess that I'm sometimes tempted to liberal nostalgia. When I hear the attacks on Planned Parenthood, I often want to remind people that back in 1964, President Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman were proud to co-chair the fundraising committee for Planned Parenthood. And I would just love to expose today's chicken hawks to Eisenhower's speech about how every bomber we build is a theft from the poor and the hungry. But that's liberal cherry picking, Ike was the same guy who tried to convince Chief Justice Earl Warren during the segregation battles that segregationists were just good people who simply didn't want, I'm putting quotation marks here, please, their sweet little girls to be sat next to a big overgrown Negro in the classroom. And as for that bipartisanship, that's of course what allowed successive administrations to overthrow the democratically elected governments of Iran, the Congo, Guatemala, and Chile. So I don't think that we want to really get into that kind of nostalgia either. And here's where I turn a corner in my talk today, and I brought along a couple notes because I'm going to I use a few data points that I really want to get right for you. So I hope you don't mind. But first, let me tell you about the corner I'm going to choose. You're a very sophisticated audience. I've talked to you before. I don't need to, tell you what's wrong with historical nostalgia. Instead, I want to take a slightly more challenging argument today. And I want to argue that there's a reverse side of historical nostalgia. And Tim talked about it a little bit. I want to go into it in a slightly different way. And that is an equally airbrushed, romanticized vision of modernity and innovation. What you might call prospective nostalgia. And in my opinion, large numbers of what we sometimes call the creative class, a little self-congratulatory there, or the knowledge industry, the failure to count the costs of not just the technological issues connected with modernization and new changes, but the economic and social processes behind them actually bears a large responsibility for the way that people's bewilderment and pain has curdled into the toxic mix of rage and delusion and past sickness that we see today. Here's the thing. No nostalgia. Well, let me just tell you this. The best advice I have ever heard from a therapist friend of mine was that when you're in an argument with your partner, you should always look for the soft emotion underneath the hard one. Try to answer that. And I believe that when we look at the kind of political polarization that Tim was talking about and incivility, you have to look for the legitimate, understandable grievances beneath the misdirected rage. And, there is a lot of that. There is a lot of that. Nostalgia is a bittersweet emotion. We usually become nostalgic when we actually miss some security, some connection, some intimacy we had in the past. But for most of us in this room, I think, and I can't see upstairs because of the lights, but I suspect for you too, the bitterness is held in check by the sweet. By the fact that over the last 40 years, a lot of these innovations have opened up more opportunities for us than they have closed down. But there's not been a lot of sweet for working class, rural, small town Americans. And in fact, they've had good reason to feel a lot of loss. And I want to actually give you some facts about that kind of loss, because it outrages me for reasons that I was talking with Moran when we first met. That's why he made it kind of personal. So I hope to get to that, and remind me if I don't. But I want to start by pointing out that despite all the racism and sexism and material hardship and all the things that we talk about in the post-war era and the 50s, and I've spent a lot of my books trying to point out that Leave It to Beaver was not a documentary. That's not how families really, really worked. Nevertheless, there were a lot of gains during that period and a lot to be missed. From 1947 to the end of the 1960s, every successive cohort of young men made 3 times as much in constant dollars in their wages as their fathers had. 3 times as much. And in every successive economic expansion of that period, 80 to 90% of the economic gains went to I'm sorry, got that wrong. See, that's why I needed my cheat sheet. 70 to 80% of the income growth went to the bottom 90% of the population, not the top 10%. Now, those gains were not all equally distributed. Women and minorities did not get their fair share, but this was a period when, thanks to the civil rights movement, Many members of those groups were able to move into the middle class or the protected unionized sector of the working class. And thanks to the regulations, the enforcement of antitrust laws, differences between communities were lessening during that entire time. Since the 1970s, we have faced a very different set of circumstances. Living standards began in the 70s. They began to soar for professionals, for information workers, for people who can wheel and deal in the financial sector, which incidentally accounts today for 25% of all profits, but only creates 4% of jobs, just to reinforce some things that Tim was saying. But for other people, there was quite a difference. Between the mid-1970s and 2007, young male high school graduates saw a 30% decline in their annual real wages. Since 1980, every successive group of young men has earned less than their fathers at the same age. We have seen this, and in every economic expansion since 1980, less and less has gone to the bottom 90%. More than 95% has gone to the top 10%. And in a few eras, it's gone 115% because they got all the gains as well as taking some of the losses from the bottom 90%. Now, there has been all along a really cavalier reaction to some of these things from the part of modernists. You know, in the 70s and 80s, most pundits said that, oh my gosh, the increased convenience to consumers of all of these cheapened products is going to be the huge difference. Even humanitarian Bill Gates, you know, said, oh, well, look, some occupations and regions will collapse, but the overall average standard of living is going to rise. During the recession, some people began to recognize the tremendous economic inequalities that are hidden behind average income increases. But now that the recovery is in full swing, or has begun to swing, we're seeing, you know, here we go again. Just last week, the chief global strategist for Morgan Stanley ridiculed people who worried about losing their jobs in the coming period, because I want to give you his quote. When new technology destroys, it leaves behind a layer of ash in which new jobs grow. Right, I live close enough to Mount St. Helen to know what happens and how well seedlings grow when they're covered, when they have to make their way up through ages, through layers of ash. And in fact, the recovery has actually exacerbated the 40-year increase in economic insecurity and inequality. Almost 90% of the wealthiest 20% of zip codes in this country between 2011 and 2015, the recovery period, gained new businesses and new jobs. But the bottom 60% got only 1 of every 4 jobs created. And of those, the 20% that were most distressed before the recession continued to lose jobs and businesses, and are continuing to do. Even the information, remember they were told us the information movement, the information revolution would create the death of distance? It's actually accelerated the inequalities of distance. Between 1980 and today, the average per capita income advantage of places like Washington and New York, coastal enclaves, tech enclaves, over the rest of the country has more than doubled. While at the same time, transportation within these winter has increased. Our accessibility to all sorts of new resources has increased, but in those other regions, now it costs twice as much to fly in and out of them as it does to San Francisco or LA, and they've lost their resources. So we have a lot of real reasons that there's been a nostalgia revolution or epidemic in the making. And I think that we need to be much more attentive for them than we have, and much more understanding of them. Now, there's one big difference, though, between the pathological nostalgia that they were finding in the 17th to 19th century and then one we have today. Then pathological nostalgia was most concentrated among people who moved away from the communities in which they were born. They may have made some material wealth, but they were really unmoored. Since that time, mobility has become so much easier for those of us who have the professional networks, the institutional support systems, the portable kind of GPSs that allow us to navigate new territory and recreate new social contacts and new information. But the very same processes have marginalized the people whose identity, whose work habits, whose social support systems depend on place and on placement in a familiar and interdependent, if sometimes hierarchical, set of interpersonal networks. Those are the people I interact with a lot in a rural community, and I want to come back to that. But I want to talk a little bit about what this means for us. Whites, for example, we know, for example, that these kinds of economic losses are most borne by minorities, African Americans and Hispanics. Among the zip codes that I talked about, the 20% depressed, blacks, the zip codes that are predominantly, if not exclusively, minority, are twice as likely to be depressed. And that's a terrible thing. We've seen this, this is always African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans bear the worst of our economic reverses. But one thing that we need to remember is that whites account for 44% of the more than 52 million Americans in the most distressed communities. What makes me sad about this is this ought to be a source of solidarity, not division among working people, since the losses of both groups are produced by the same forces that have produced our on-demand, all-demand, no reciprocity economy that we're dealing with. And shame on us if we have not been able to make that case for solidarity strongly and actively enough to counter the racists and the xenophobes who've been waiting in the wings to make a different case. I get a little emotional about this. And I don't think better algorithms and fact-checking is going to solve the problem. Fact-checking, in fact, I hope you realize this, actually often reinforces people's delusions rather than overcomes them. We need an alternative narrative that respects the sense of loss people feel, however misguided we may think it is, and presents an alternative diagnosis and solution. And while I'm all in favor of turning down the heat under our political discussion, I'm not really convinced that, calls for returns to civility and cooperation are what we need, or another C word that I could do without, compassion. Compassion is a pretty word for pity, and it has nothing to do with respect. And we need respect. We need respect, and okay, now I'll fit in the one that Moran asked me to do. My husband and I have a very small organic farm. we're very proud of the fact that when our animals are killed, they only get one bad second in their life because we don't move them out anyplace else to be transported. The slaughterers come out to take care of them. These slaughterers drive about 20 miles to our place with a big investment truck that they need to do it. They take a cow that weighs 1,600 pounds. They shoot it perfectly in the head, you know. Even if it jumps, their aim is so good, this takes a lot of practice, so that there's no inhumanity there. Then they hoist it up, they cut it in half, they cut the hooves off, they cut the top off, they skin it in one big piece so that people can use the hide if they want, they gut it, they cut it in half, they get it ready to send to the butchers who are going to cut it down to the break, into the different pieces, and they go off another 20 miles to take it to them. What do you think it costs us? $65 a cow. Think how long it takes one of these finance guys to earn $65, you know, on the phone. I think that's outrageous. I think we should be angry about it. And, you know, so I'm not for the end of anger. I'm with Aristotle. Aristotle said anger can be dangerous, but he didn't think not having anger. In fact, he thought indignation, righteous, angry indignation, was one of the main prime virtues. The problem with anger, he says, is it's not always done in the right way. He wrote, wisdom is not the ability not to be angry. It's the ability to be angry with the right person or institution, to the right degree, at the right time, and for the right purpose. Now, if we are to help the Americans who've been left out, the ones that Tim was talking about, to use their anger wisely, we've got to mobilize our indignation. And I think that's a very important thing. And we need to be clear about its central target, not people who have different vocabularies or cultures or taste in music or food or makes ideas even that we consider stupid. There should be one dividing line that actually activates our anger, and that is that we are furious at the people who don't respect the dignity of labor and the right to a living wage, whether that wage is earned by working on a computer or by using a lathe, by taking care of our internet connections or taking care of our children. I've got to wrap up here. I've spent a lot of my career knocking down nostalgia for the past, but there's one American tradition I would like to revive. The idea that the people who make our coffee, who make our beds, who make our trains run on time, who fix our cars, who package our food, who patrol our parks, who pick up our garden, they are instigators too. They make things happen. They deserve to live in thriving communities. They deserve to live in thriving communities, to make a decent wage. They deserve to get home in time to have dinner with whoever they count as family, and to have a decent retirement, send their kids to good schools. And we need to demonstrate in practice that our commitment is with them, not with anyone who denies that, even if we go to the same operas or cultures or eat the same arugula or whatever it may be. Let's instigate that. Thank you.